Chapter 11. Celaena felt as if she'd barely closed her eyes when a hand jabbed her side. She groaned, wincing as the drapes were thrown back to welcome the morning sun. "Wake up." Not surprisingly, it was Cale. She shimmied beneath the blankets, pulling them over her head, but he grabbed the covers and threw them to the floor. Her nightgown was wrapped around her thighs. Celaena shivered. "It's cold," she moaned, holding her knees to her body. She didn't care that. She had only a few months to beat the other champions. She needed sleep. It would have been nice if the Crown Prince had considered springing her from Endivere earlier so she could have some time to regain her strength. How long had he known about this competition, anyway? "Get up." Cale ripped the pillows from beneath her head. "Now you're wasting my time." If he noticed how much skin she was showing, he didn't react. Grumbling, Celaena slithered to the edge of the bed, dangling a hand over the edge to touch the floor. "Fetch my slippers," she mumbled. "The floor's like ice." He growled, but Celaena ignored him as she got to her feet. She staggered and slouched into the dining room, where an enormous breakfast lay on the table. Cale jerked his chin toward the food. "Eat up. The competition starts in an hour." Whatever nerves she felt, she kept them hidden from him as she gave an exaggerated sigh and collapsed into a chair with the grace of a large beast. Celaena scanned the table. Yet again, there were no knives. She stabbed her fork into a piece of sausage. From the doorway, Cale asked, "Why, might I ask, are you so tired?" She gulped down the rest of the pomegranate juice and wiped her mouth on a napkin. "I was up until 4 reading," she said. "I sent a letter to your princeling, asking for permission to borrow books from the library. He granted my wish and sent 7 books from his personal library that I'm commanded to read." Cale shook his head in disbelief. "It isn't your place to write to the Crown Prince." She gave him a simpering smile and took a bite of ham. He could have ignored the letter. "And besides, I'm his champion. Not everyone feels obligated to be as nasty to me as you do. You're an assassin. If I say I'm a jewel thief, will you treat me with more courtesy?" She waved a hand. "Don't answer that." She spooned porridge into her mouth, found it to bedland, and scooped 4 heaping mounds of brown sugar into the gray mess. Would the competitors actually be worthy opponents? Before she could start worrying, she examined his black clothes. "Don't you ever wear normal clothing?" "Hurry up," was all he said. The competition awaited. Suddenly not hungry, she pushed away her bowl of porridge. "I should get dressed, then." She turned her head to call for Philippa, but paused. "Just what sort of activities might I expect at the tournament today?" "So I can dress accordingly, of course." "I don't know, they don't give us the details until you arrive." The captain rose and drummed the pommel of his sword before calling to a servant as Celaena walked into her bedroom. Behind her, Cale spoke to the servant girl. "Dress her in pants and a shirt, something loose, nothing frilly or revealing, and bring a cloak." The girl disappeared into the dressing room. Celaena followed after her, unceremoniously stripping down to her underclothes and enjoying it far too much when Cale's cheeks reddened before he turned away. A few minutes later, Celaena frowned at herself as she hurried after the captain into the foyer. "I look ridiculous. These pants are absurd, and this shirt awful." "Stop whining. No one gives a damn about your clothes." He flung open the door to the hall, the guards outside instantly at attention. "Besides, you can take them off at the barracks. I'm sure everyone will be thrilled to see you in your undergarments." She swore violently under her breath, pulling her green velvet cloak tight around herself, and trailed after him. The captain of the guard rushed through the castle, still freezing with the early morning chill, and they soon entered the barracks. Guards in various states of armor saluted them. An open doorway revealed a large mess hall, where many of the guards were just sitting down to breakfast. Finally, Hale stopped somewhere on the ground floor. The giant rectangular room they entered was the size of the grand ballroom. Lined with pillars that supported a mezzanine, the floor was checkered black and white tile, and the floor-to-ceiling glass doors that made up one entire wall were open, the gossamer curtains blowing in the chilly breeze that drifted in from the garden. Most of the 23 other champions were already scattered throughout the room, sparring with what could only be their sponsors' trainers. Everyone was carefully monitored by guards. None bothered to look at her, save for that slightly handsome young man with the gray eyes, who gave her a half-smile before returning to firing arrows at a target across the room with unnerving accuracy. She lifted her chin and surveyed a rack of weapons. "You expect me to house a mace an hour after sunrise?" 6 guards appeared in the doorway behind them, joining the dozens already. In the chamber, swords at the ready. "If you attempt anything foolish," Hale said quietly, "they'll be here. I'm just a jewel thief, remember?" She approached the rack. Foolish. Decision to leave all those weapons out. Swords, swordbreakers, axes, bows, pikes, hunting daggers, maces, spears, throwing knives, wooden staves. While she generally preferred the stealth of a dagger, she was familiar with every weapon here. She glanced around the sparring room and hid her grimace. Sour most of the competitors, it seemed. As she inspected them, she caught a movement in the corner of her vision. Kane entered the hall, flanked by 2 guards and a scarred, burly man who must have been his trainer. She squared her shoulders as Kane strode straight toward her, his thick lips parting in a grin. "Good morning," he said, his voice raspy and deep. His dark eyes snaked along her body, then found her face again. "I'd have thought you'd be running home by now." She gave him a close-lipped smile. "The fun's just starting, isn't it?" Kane returned her smile and stalked off. It would have been so easy. So easy to whirl and grab him by the neck and slam his face into the ground. She didn't even realize she was trembling with rage until Cale stepped into her line of vision. "Save it for the competition," he said softly, but not weakly. "I'm going to kill him," she breathed. "No, you're not. If you want to shut him up, then beat him. He's just a brute. From the king's army, don't waste your strength on hating him." She rolled her eyes. "Thank you so much for interfering on my behalf. You don't need me to rescue you. It still would have been nice. You can fight your own battles." He pointed with his sword to the weapons rack. "Pick one." His eyes shone with the challenge as she untied her cloak and tossed it behind her. "Let's see if you can actually back up your swaggering." She'd shut Kane up in an unmarked grave for all eternity. But for now, she'd make Cale eat his words. All the weapons were finally made, and glistened in the sunlight. Celaena eliminated her options one by one, seeing each weapon for what sort of damage she might do to the captain's face. Her heart beat rapidly as she ran a finger across the blades and handles of each. She found herself torn between the hunting daggers and a lovely rapier with an ornate bell guard. She could cut out his heart from a safe distance with that. The sword whined as she drew it from the stand and held it in her hands. It was a good blade, strong, smooth, light. They wouldn't let her have a butter knife on her table, but they gave her access to this? Why not wear him down a bit? Cale tossed his cape on top of hers, his toned body flexing through the dark threads of his shirt. He drew his sword. "On your guard." He moved into defensive position, and Celaena looked at him dully. Who do you think you are? What sort of person says on your guard, aren't you first going to show me the basics, she said quietly enough for only him to hear, her sword dangling from one hand. She rubbed the hilt, her fingers contracting on the cool surface. I was in Endeavor for a year, you realize. I could have easily forgotten. From the amount of killing that went on in your section of the mines, I highly doubt you've forgotten a thing. That was with a pickaxe, she said, her smile growing feral. All I had to do was crack a man's head open or hurl the axe into his stomach. Thankfully, none of the other champions paid them any heed. If you consider that sort of gracelessness equal to swordsmanship, what sort of fighting do you do, Captain Westfall? She put a spare hand over her heart and closed her eyes for emphasis. With a growl, the captain of the guard lunged. But she had been waiting for some time now, and her eyes flew open as soon as his boots scraped against the ground. With a turn of her arm she brought the sword into blocking position, her legs bracing for the impact as steel struck steel. The noise was strange, somehow more painful than receiving the blow, but Celaena thought little of it when he charged again and she met his weapon, parrying with ease. Her arms ached as they were shaken from their slumber, but she continued to deflect and parry. Swordplay was like dancing, certain steps must be followed or else it would fall apart. Once she heard the beat, it all came rushing back. The other competitors faded away into shadows and sunlight. Good, he said through his teeth, blocking her thrust as she forced him to take a defensive stance. Her thighs burned. Very good, he breathed. He was pretty good himself, better than good, actually. Not that she'd tell him that. With a clang, the two swords met, and they pressed each other's blades. He was stronger, and she grunted at the force required to hold her sword against his, but, strong as he might be, he was not as quick. She withdrew and fainted, her feet jabbing and flexing on the floor with bird-like grace. Caught off guard, he only had time to deflect, his parry lost in his size. She surged forward, her arm coming down again and again, twisting and turning, loving the smooth ache within her shoulder as the blade slammed against his. She was moving fast like a dancer in a temple ritual, fast like a snake in the red desert, fast like water down the side of a mountain. He kept up, and she allowed him to advance before reclaiming the position. He tried to catch her unawares with a blow to the face, but her anger awoke as her elbow snapped up and deflected, slamming into his fist and forcing it down. Something to remember when fighting me, Sardothien, he panted. The sun caught in his golden brown eyes. She grunted, lunging to deflect his newest attack. I don't lose. He grinned at her, and before she could comprehend the words, something cut into her feet and she had the sickening feeling of falling. She gasped as her spine collided with marble, the rapier flying from her hand. Cale pointed his blade at her heart. I win, he breathed. She pushed herself onto her elbows. You had to resort to tripping me. That's hardly winning at all. I'm not the one with the sword at my heart. The sound of clashing weapons and labored breathing filled the air. She flicked her eyes to the other champions, who were all in the middle of sparring, all, of course, except Cain. He grinned broadly at her, and Celaena bared her teeth. You have the skills, Cale said, but some of your moves are still undisciplined. She broke her stare with Cain and glared up into Cale's face. That's never stopped me from killing before, she spat. Cale chuckled at her agitation and pointed his sword at the rack, allowing her to get to her feet. Pick another something different. Make it interesting, too, something that will make me sweat, please. You'll be sweating when I skin you alive and squish your eyeballs beneath my feet, she muttered, picking up the rapier. That's the spirit. She practically threw the rapier into place, and drew the hunting knives. Without hesitation. My dear old friends. A wicked smile spread across her face. Chapter 12. Just as Celaena was about to launch herself and her knives at the captain, someone stomped a spear on the ground and called the room to attention. She faced the voice and found a stocky, balding man standing beneath the mezzanine. Your attention now, the man repeated. Celaena looked to Cale, who nodded, taking the knives from her as they joined the 23 other competitors encircling the man. I'm Theodos Burlo, weapons master and judge of this competition. Of course, our king's the final judge of you sorry lot, but I'll be the one determining every day if you're fit to be his champion. He patted his sword hilt, and Celaena had to admire the beautiful woven gold of the pommel. I've been weapons master here for 30 years, and lived in his castle for 25 more than that. I've trained many a lord and knight, and many a would-be champion of Adarlan. It will be very hard to impress me. Beside Celaena, Cale stood with his shoulders thrown back. It occurred to her that Burlo might have trained the captain. Given how easily Cale had kept up with her, if Burlo had trained him, then the weapons master must live up to his title. She knew better than anyone not to underestimate opponents based on their appearance. The king's already told you all there is to know about this competition, Burlo said, holding his hands behind his back. But I figured you lot are itching to know more about each other. He pointed a stubby finger at Cain. What's your name, occupation, and where do you hail from? And be honest about it, I know none of you are bakers and candlestick makers. Cain's insufferable grin returned. Cain, soldier in the king's army. I hail from the White-Fanned Mountains. Of course he did. She'd heard tales of the brutality of the mountain folk from that region, and seen a few of them up close, seen the fierceness in their eyes. Many of them had rebelled against Adarlan, and most wound up dead. What would his fellow mountain dwellers say if they could see him now? She gritted her teeth. What would the people of Terrasen say if they could see her now? Burlo, however, either didn't know or didn't care, and didn't even give a nod. Before he pointed to the man to Cain's right. Celaena immediately liked him, and you? A slender, tall man with thinning blonde hair surveyed the circle and sneered. Xavier Forel. Master Thief of Melisande. Master Thief. That man? Of course. She realized, his reed thinness probably aided in slipping into houses. Maybe it wasn't a bluff. One by one, the 21 other competitors introduced themselves. There were 6 more seasoned soldiers, all of them thrown out of the army for questionable behavior, which must have been truly questionable, given that Adarlan's army was notorious for ruthlessness. Then there were the 3 other thieves, including the dark-haired, gray-eyed Noxoan, whom she'd actually heard of in passing, and who'd been giving her such charming smiles all morning. The 3 mercenaries looked ready to boil someone alive, and then there were the 2 shackled murderers. As his name suggested, Bill Chastain, the Eye-Eater, ate the eyes of his victims. He looked surprisingly plain, with mousy brown hair, tan skin, and average height, though Celaena had trouble not staring at his scar-flecked mouth. The other murderer was Ned Clement, who'd gone for 3 years under the name Scythe, for the weapon he'd used to torture and hack apart temple priestesses. It was a wonder they hadn't executed either man, though from their tanned skin, she guessed they'd spent the years since their captures toiling under the sun in Calaculla, the southern sister labor camp to Endivere. Next came 2 scarred, silent men who seemed to be cronies of some far-off warlord, and then the 5 assassins. She immediately forgot the names of the first 4, a gangly, haughty boy, a hulking brute, a disdainful runt of a man, and a sniveling, hawk-nosed prat who claimed he had an affinity for knives. They weren't even in the Assassin's Guild, not that Arab and Hamel would ever allow them in. Membership required years of training and a more than impressive track record. While these four might be skilled, they lacked the refinement that Arabin favored in his followers. She'd have to keep an eye on them, but at least they weren't the silent assassins from the windswept dunes of the Red Desert. Those would be worthy of her, they'd make her sweat a bit. She'd spent a month training with them one burning summer, and her muscles still ached at the memory of their grueling exercises. The last assassin, who called himself Grave, made her pause. He was slight and short, with the kind of wicked face that made people quickly look away. He'd entered the room wearing shackles, and only had them removed when his guards, all 5 of them, gave him a stern warning. Even now, they stood nearby, watching him relentlessly. As he introduced himself, Grave flashed an oily smile, revealing his brown teeth. Her disgust didn't improve when Grave ran an eye over her body. An assassin like that never stopped at just killing. Note if his victim was female. She willed herself to hold his hungry gaze. "And you?" Brullo said, cutting into her thoughts. "Lilian Gordina," she said, holding her chin high. "Jewel thief from Belhaven." Some of the men sniggered, and she clenched her teeth. They'd stop there, laughing if they knew her true name, if they knew that this jewel thief could skin them alive without a knife. "Fine," Brullo said, waving a hand. "You all have 5 minutes to put away your weapons and catch your breath. Then we're on a mandatory run to see how fit you are. Those of you who can't run the distance go home, or back to whatever prison your sponsors found you rotting in. Your first test is in 5 days. Consider us merciful it's not sooner." With that, everyone scattered, the champions murmuring to their trainers about whatever competitor they deemed the biggest threat. Cain or Grave, most likely. Certainly not a jewel thief from Belhaven. Hale remained beside her, watching the champions stride off. She hadn't spent 8 years building a reputation and a year laboring in Endeavour to be disregarded like this. "If I Havito call myself a jewel thief again?" Hale raised his brows. "You'll do what, exactly? Do you know how insulting it is to pretend to be some nobody thief from a small city in Fenharo?" He stared her down, quiet for a moment. "Are you that arrogant?" She bristled, but he went on. "It was foolish to spar with you just now. I'll admit that I hadn't realized you'd be that good." Thankfully, no one noticed. "And do you want to know why, Lilian?" He took a step closer, his voice lowering. "Because you're some pretty little girl. Because you're a nobody jewel thief from a small city in Fenharo. Look around." He half turned to the other champions. "Is anyone staring at you? Are any of them sizing you up?" "No. Because you're not real competition. Because you don't stand between them and whatever freedom or wealth they're looking for." "Exactly. It's insulting. It's smart, that's what it is. And you're going to keep a low profile throughout this entire competition. You're not going to excel, and you're not going to trounce those thieves and soldiers and unknown assassins. You're going to stay solidly in the middle, where no one will look your way, because you're not a threat, because they'll think that you'll be eliminated sooner or later, and they should focus their attention on getting rid of bigger, stronger, faster champions like Cain. But you're going to outlast them," Hale continued. "And when they wake up on the morning of the final duel and find that you are their opponent, and that you have beaten them, the look on their faces will make all of the insults and lack of attention worthwhile." He extended his hand to lead her outside. "So what do you have to say about that, Lilian Gordina?" "I can look out for myself," she said lightly, taking his hand. "But I have to Say that you're rather brilliant, Captain. So brilliant, actually, that I might give you one of the jewels I plan to steal from the Queen tonight." Cale chuckled, and they strode outside to where the running contest awaited. Her lungs burned and her legs were leaden, but she kept running, kept her position in the middle of the pack of champions. Brullo, Cale, and the other trainers along with 36 armed guards followed them around the game park on horseback. Some of the champions, Grave, Ned, and Bill included, had been given long manacles. She supposed it was a privilege that Cale hadn't locked her up, too. But to her surprise, Cain led the pack, and was nearly 10 yards in front of the rest of them. How could he possibly be that fast? The sound of crunching leaves and labored breathing filled the warm autumn air, and Celaena kept her gaze on the damp and gleaming dark hair of the thief in front of her. One step after another, one breath in, one breath out. Breathe she had to remember to keep breathing. Ahead, Cain turned a corner, heading north back toward the castle. Like a flock of birds, they followed him. One step after another, never slowing down, let them all watch Cain, let them plot against him. She didn't need to win the race to prove she was better without any kind of validation that the king could give her. She missed a breath, and her knees wobbled, but she kept upright. The run would be over soon. Soon. She hadn't even dared to look behind her to see if any had fallen. She could feel Cale's eyes on her, though, reminding her to keep in the middle. At least he had that much faith in her. The trees parted, revealing the field that lay between the game park and the stables. The end of the path. Her head spun, and she would have cursed at the stitch that lanced through her side had she had any breath to do so. She had Tosti in the middle. Stay in the middle. Cain cleared the trees and raised his arms above his head in victory. He ran a few more feet, slowing his pace to cool down, and his trainer cheered for him. Celaena's only response was to keep her feet moving. Only a few yards left. The light of the open field grew brighter and brighter as it approached. Stars flashed before her eyes, swarming in her vision. She had to stay in the middle. Years off training with Arab and Hamel had taught her the dangers of giving up too easily. Then, she was through the trees, and the open field surrounded her in an explosion of space and grass and blue sky. The men in front of her slowed to a stop. It was all she could do to keep from sinking to her knees, but she made her legs slow, made her feet walk, made herself take breath after breath as the stars continued bursting before her eyes. "Good," Brullo said, reining his horse and surveying whoever had first returned. "Get water. We've got more training after this." Through the spots in her vision, she saw Cale stop his horse. Her feet moved of their own accord toward him, then passed, back to the woods. "Where are you going?" "I dropped my ring back there," she lied, doing her best to look scatterbrained. "Just give me a moment to find it." Without waiting for his approval, she entered the trees to the sneers and snickers of the champions who had overheard. From the approaching crashing noises, she knew another champion was on his way out. She stepped into the cover of the bushes, stumbling as the world became dark and light and tilted. She had barely sunk to her knees when she vomited. She heaved and heaved until she had nothing left inside. The straggling champion passed by. On trembling limbs, she grappled onto a nearby tree and hauled herself upright again. She found Captain Westfall standing across the path, watching her with pursed lips. She wiped her mouth on the back of her wrist and said nothing to him as she exited the woods. Chapter 13. It was lunchtime when Brullo released them for the day, and to say that Celaena was hungry would be a severe understatement. She was halfway through her meal, shoveling meat and bread down her throat, when the dining room door opened. "What are you doing here?" she said through a mouthful. What? Said the captain of the guard, taking a seat at the table. He'd changed his clothes and taken a bath. He pulled a platter of salmon toward him and piled it on his plate. Celaena made a disgusted face, her nose crinkling. You'dn't care for salmon? I hate fish. I'd rather die than eat it. That's surprising, he said, taking a bite. Why? Because you smell like one. She opened her mouth to expose the ball of bread and beef that she was chewing. He shook his head. You might fight well, but your manners are a disgrace. She waited for him to mention her earlier vomiting, but he didn't continue. I can act and talk like a lady, if it pleases me. Then I suggest that you begin to do so. After a pause, he asked, How are you enjoying your temporary freedom? Is that a snide remark or an honest question? He took a bite of fish. Whichever you like. The window revealed the afternoon sky, slightly pale, but still lovely. I'm enjoying it, for the most part. Especially now that I have books to read whenever you lock me in here. I don't suppose you'd understand. On the contrary. I might not have as much time to read as you and Dorian do. But that doesn't mean I love books any less. She bit into an apple. It was tart, with a sweet, honey-like aftertaste. Oh. And what books do you love? He named a few, and she blinked. Well, those are good choices for the most part. What others? She asked, and somehow, an hour flew by, carrying them on the wings of conversation. Suddenly, the clock chimed one, and he rose. The afternoon is yours to spend in any way that you like. Where are you going? To rest my limbs and my lungs. Yes, well, hopefully you'll read something of quality before I see you again. He sniffed the air as he walked out of her room. Hopefully you'll take a bath. Before I see you again. Sighing, Celaena called to her servants to draw her bath. An afternoon of reading on the balcony beckoned. The following dawn, Celena's bedroom door opened, and a familiar stocking gait echoed through the room. Cale Westfall stopped short when he found the assassin dangling from the beam of the bedroom doorway, repeatedly hoisting herself up to touch her chin to the wooden bar. Sweat soaked her undershirt and ran in rivulets down her pale skin. She'd been exercising for an hour already. Her arms quivered as she lifted herself again. Though she might pretend to be in the middle of the pack, there was no reason to train like it. Even if every repetition made her body scream for her to stop, she wasn't that out of shape after all. Her pickaxe in the mines had been heavy, and it definitely had nothing to do with her fellow competitors walloping her at the race yesterday. She already had an edge on them. She just needed it to be a bit sharper. She didn't pause her exercising as she smiled at him, panting through her clenched teeth. To her surprise, he smiled back. By that afternoon, a vicious rainstorm arrived, and Cale permitted Celaena toke around the castle with him after she'd finished training with the other champions for the day. Though he spoke little, she was glad to be out of her rooms, and dressed in one of her new gowns, a lovely lilac silk dress with pale pink lace accents and pearl beading. But then they rounded a corner and nearly collided with Celaena Sardothien. The assassin would have grimaced, but she forgot all about Celaena as her eyes fell upon her companion. It was an alewoman. She was stunning, long and lean, each of her features perfectly formed and smooth. Her loose white dress contrasted with her creamy brown skin, and a three-plated gold torque covered much of her chest and neck. Bracelets of ivory and gold glimmered around her wrists, and her feet were sandaled beneath matching anklets. A thin circlet comprising dangling gold and jewels crowned her head. She had 2 male guards with her, armed to the teeth with an assortment of curved Ailwi daggers and swords, both of them studying Celaena and Celaena, closely weighing the threat. The Ailwi girl was a princess. Captain Westfall, Celaena said, and curtsied. Beside her, a short man dressed in the red and black garb of a councilman bowed to the pair. The Islwey princess stood perfectly still, her brown eyes wary as she took in Celaena and her companion. Celaena offered her a slight smile, and the princess stepped closer, her guards tensing slightly. She moved with an easy grace. Celaena gestured to the girl, poorly hidden distaste written across her beautiful face. This is Her Royal Highness, the Princess Nehemia Itker of Islwey. Celaena bowed low. The princess nodded, barely a dip of her chin. Celaena knew the name. She had often heard the Islwey slaves in Endeavour boast of Nehemia's beauty and bravery. Nehemia, the light of Islwey, who would save them from their plight. Nehemia, who might someday pose a threat to the King of Adarlan's rule over her home country when she ascended to the throne. Nehemia, they whispered, who smuggled information and supplies to the rebel groups hiding in Islwey. But what was she doing here? And the Lady Lillian, Celaena added briskly. Celaena dropped into the lowest curtsy she could give without falling and said, "In Islwey, welcome to Rifthold, Your Highness." Princess Nehemia smiled slowly, and the others gaped. The councilman beamed, wiping the sweat from his brow. Why hadn't they sent Nehemia with the Crown Prince, or even Parrington? Why was the princess herded around by Celaena Rompier? "Thank you," the princess replied, her voice low. "I imagine you've had a long journey," Celaena continued, in Islwey. "Have you arrived today, Your Highness?" Nehemia's guards exchanged glances, and Nehemia's brows rose slightly. Not too many northerners spoke their language. "Yes, and the Queen sent this one." Nehemia jerked her head at Celaena, "to bring me around with that sweating worm of a man as well." The princess narrowed her eyes at the small councilman, who wrung his hands and dabbed his forehead with a handkerchief. Perhaps he knew what sort of threat Nehemia posed, but why bring her to the castle? Celaena ran her tongue across her teeth, trying not to laugh. "He seems a bit nervous." She had to change the subject, or else she'd indeed laugh. "What do you make of the castle?" "It's the most foolish thing I've ever seen," Nehemia said, scanning the ceiling, as if she could see through the stone and into the glass sections. "I'd sooner enter a castle made of sand." Celaena watched them, somewhat disbelievingly. "I'm afraid I haven't understood a word you've said," Celaena interrupted. Celaena tried not to roll her eyes. She'd forgotten the woman was there. "We," the princess said, struggling for the word in the common language. "We're talking with the weather." "About the weather," Celaena corrected sharply. "Watch your mouth," Celaena snapped before she could think. Celaena gave Celaena a vicious little smile. "If she's here to learn our ways, I should correct her so she doesn't sound foolish." Here to learn their ways, or for something else entirely? The faces of the princess and her guards were unreadable. "Your Highness," Celaena said, stepping forward, a subtle movement to keep himself between Nehemia and Celaena. "Are you having a tour of the castle?" Nehemia chewed on the words and then looked to Celaena, brows high as if she'd expected a translation by now. A smile tugged on the corners of Celaena's lips. No wonder the councilman was sweating so profusely. Nehemia was a force to be reckoned with. Celaena translated Celaena's question with ease. "If you consider this structure of madness to be a castle," Nehemia replied. Celaena turned to Celaena. "She says yes." "I never knew so many words to mean one," Celaena said with faux sweetness. Celaena's nails dug into her palms. "I'm going to rip your hair out." Celaena took another step toward Nehemia, effectively blocking Celaena's path to Celaena. "Smart man." He put a hand on his chest. "Your Highness, I am the captain of the Royal Guard. Please allow me to escort you." Celaena translated again, and the princess nodded. "Get rid of her," she said flatly to Celaena, and then waved a hand toward Celaena. "I don't care for her temperament." "You're dismissed," Celaena said to Celaena, flashing a bright smile. "The princess tires of your company." Celaena started. "But the queen—" "If that is her highness's wish, then it will be granted," Hale interrupted. Though his features were a mask of protocol, she could have sworn she glimpsed a glimmer of amusement in his eyes. Celaena wanted to hug him. She didn't bother to nod her farewell to Celaena as the princess and the councilman joined them, and they strode down the hall, leaving the fuming lady behind. "Are all of your royal women like that?" the princess said to Celaena in Alway. "Like Celaena?" "Unfortunately, your highness." Nehemia examined the assassin, and Celaena knew she was taking in her clothes, her gait, her posture, everything Celaena herself had observed about the princess already. "But you're not like them. How do you know how to speak Awi so well?" Celaena thought of a lie, studied it for several years. "You use the intonation of the peasants. Is that taught in your books?" "I knew an Ailwe woman who taught it to me." "A slave of yours?" Her tone sharpened, and Cale flicked his eyes toward them. "No," Celaena said hurriedly. "I don't believe in keeping slaves." Something twisted in her gut at the thought of all those slaves she'd left behind in Endovier, all those people doomed to suffer until they died. Just because she'd left Endovier didn't mean Endovier had ceased to be. Nehemia's voice was soft. "Then you are very unlike your court companions." Celaena could only manage a nod to the princess as they turned their attention to the hall ahead. Servants darted past, eyes wide when they beheld the princess and her guards. After a moment of silence, Celaena squared her shoulders. "Why are you in Rifthold, if I might ask?" She added, "Your Highness. You don't need to bother calling me that." The princess toyed with one of the gold bangles around her wrist. "I came at the request of my father, the King of Ailwe, to learn your language and customs so I might better serve Ailwe and me people." Given what she'd heard of Nehemia, Celaena didn't think that was the entirety of it, but she smiled politely as she said, "How long will you remain in Rifthold?" "Until my father sends for me again." She stopped playing with her bracelets as she frowned at the rain pounding the windows. "If I'm fortunate, I'll only be here until spring. Unless my father decides that a man from Adarlan might make him a good consort, and then I'll be here until that matter is settled." Seeing the annoyance in the princess's eyes, Celaena felt a shred of pity for whatever man her father chose. A thought struck her, and Celaena tilted her head to the side. "Whom would you marry? Prince Dorian?" It was prying, and a bit impertinent, and she regretted the question the second it came out. But Nehemia just clicked her tongue. "That pretty boy? He grinned at me far too much, and you should only see how he winked at the other women in the court. I want a husband to warm my bed, and my bed alone." She glanced sidelong at the assassin, giving her another head-to-toe examination. Celaena caught the princess's eyes lingering on the few scars on her hands. "Where are you from, Lillian?" Celaena casually hid her hands in the folds of her gown. "Belhaven, a city in Fenharrow. It's a fishing port. Smells terrible." That wasn't a lie. Every time she'd visited Belhaven for a mission, the reek of fish made her gag if she got too near the docks. The princess chuckled. "Rifthold smells terrible. Too many people. At least in Banjali, the sun burns up everything. And my father's river palace smells like lotus blossoms." Hale cleared his throat beside them, obviously tired of being excluded from the conversation, and Celaena grinned at him. "Don't be so glum, she said in the common tongue. We must cater to the princess. Stop your gloating, he said, his brows low. He put a hand on the hilt of his sword, and Nehemia's guards stepped closer to him. Though Cale might be captain of the guard, Celaena didn't doubt for a moment that Nehemia's guards would put him down if he became a threat. We're only bringing her back to the King's council. I'm going to have a word with them about allowing Celaena to show her around. Do you hunt? Nehemia interrupted in Ialwi. Me? The princess nodded. No, Celaena said, then switched back to Ialwi. I'm more of a reader. Nehemia looked toward a rain-splattered window. Most of our books were burned 5 years ago, when a Darlin marched in. It didn't make a difference if books were about magic. Her voice quieted at the word, even though Celaena the councilman couldn't understand them or history. They just burned the libraries whole, along with the museums and universities. A familiar ache filled her chest. Celaena nodded. Alwi wasn't the only country where that happened. Something cold and bitter glittered in Nehemia's eyes. Now, most of the books we receive are from Darlin books in a language I can barely understand. That's also what I must learn while I'm here. There are so many things. She stomped her foot, her jewelry clinking. And I hate these shoes, and this miserable dress. I don't care if it's Ialwi silk, and I'm supposed to bear representing my kingdom. The material's been itching me ever since I put it in. She stared at Celaena's elaborate gown. How can you stand wearing that enormous thing? Celaena picked at the skirts of her dress. It breaks my ribs, to be honest. Well, at least I'm not the only one suffering, Nehemia said. Cale stopped before a door and informed the 6 sentries posted outside to watch the women and the princess's guards. What's he doing? Returning you to the council and ensuring that Celaena doesn't lead you around again. Nehemia's shoulders slumped slightly. I've only been here for a day, and I wish to leave. She let out a long sigh through her nose, and again turned to the window, as if she could see all the way back to Ialwi. Suddenly, she grabbed Celaena's hand and squeezed it. Her fingers were surprisingly calloused in all the spots where the hilt of a sword or dagger might rest. Celaena's eyes met with those of the princess and she dropped her hand. Perhaps the rumors were correct about her association with the rebels in Ialwi. Will you keep me company while I'm here, Lady Lillian? Celaena blinked at the request, feeling, despite herself, honored. Of course. When I'm available, I'll gladly attend you. I have attendants. I wish for someone to talk to. Celaena couldn't help it, she beamed. Cale entered into the hallway once more, and bowed to the princess. The council would like to see you. Celaena translated. Nehemia let out a low groan, but thanked Cale before turning to Celaena. I'm glad we met, Lady Lillian, Nehemia said, her eyes bright. Peace be with you. And with you, the assassin murmured, watching her leave. She never had many friends, and the ones she had often disappointed her. Sometimes with devastating consequences, as she'd learned that summer with the silent assassins of the Red Desert. After that, she'd sworn never to trust girls again, especially girls with agendas and power of their own. Girls who would do anything to get what they wanted. But as the door closed behind the ivory train of the Ialwi princess, Celaena wondered if she'd been wrong. Cale Westfall watched the assassin eat lunch, her eyes darting from one plate to the next. She had immediately stripped from her gown upon entering her rooms, and now sat in a rose and jade dressing robe that suited her well. You're awfully quiet today, she said, her mouth full of food. Would she never stop eating? She ate more than anyone he knew, including his guards. She had multiple helpings of every course at each meal. Enthralled by the Princess Nehemia? The words were barely distinguishable from her chewing. That headstrong girl? He immediately regretted the remark as her eyes narrowed. A lecture was coming on, and he was in no mood to be patronized. He had more important things on his mind. Before departing this morning, the king hadn't taken any of the guards he'd suggested he bring on his journey, and refused to say where he was going, or to accept his offer of accompaniment. Not to mention the fact that a few of the royal hounds had gone missing, only to have their half-eaten remains found in the northern wing of the palace. That was worrisome. Who would do such a gruesome thing? And what's wrong with headstrong girls, she pressed, other than the fact that they're not wooden-headed ninnies who can only open their mouths to give orders and gossip? I just prefer a certain type of woman. Thankfully, it was the right thing to say, because she batted her eyelashes. And what type of woman is that? Not an arrogant assassin. She pouted. Suppose I wasn't an assassin. Would you fancy me then? No. Would you prefer Lady Celaena? Don't be a fool. It was easy to be mean, but it was also getting far too easy to be nice. He took a bite of bread. She watched him, her head angled. He sometimes felt that she looked at him the way a cat regards a mouse. He just wondered how long it would take for her to pounce. She shrugged, and took a bite from an apple. There was something girlish about her, too. Oh, he couldn't stand her contradictions. You're staring, Captain. He almost apologized, but stopped. She was a haughty, vulgar, utterly impertinent assassin. He wished for the months to fly by, for her to be appointed champion, and then, once her years of servitude were over, to be gone. He hadn't slept well since they'd taken her out of Endeavour. You've a food in your teeth, he said. She picked it out with a sharp nail and turned her head to the window. The rain slid down the glass. Was she looking at rain, or something beyond? He sipped from his goblet. Despite her arrogance, she was clever, and relatively kind, and somewhat charming. But where was that writhing darkness? Why didn't it show itself so he could just throw her into the dungeon and call off this ridiculous competition? There was something great and deadly concealed within her, and he didn't like it. He'd be ready when the time came, he'd be waiting. He just wondered which one of them would survive. Chapter 14. For the next 4 days, Celaena awoke before dawn to train in her room, using whatever she could to exercise: chairs, the doorway, even her billiards table and cue sticks. The balls made for remarkable balance tools. Around dawn, Hale usually showed up for breakfast. Afterward, they ran through the game park, where he kept pace at her side. Autumn had fully come, and the wind smelled off crisp leaves and snow. Hale never said anything when she doubled over, hands in her knees, and vomited up her breakfast, nor did he comment on the fact that she could go farther and farther each day without stopping for breath. Once they'd finished their run, they trained in a private room far from her competitor's eyes. Until, that is, she collapsed to the ground and cried that she was about to die of hunger and fatigue. At lessons, the knives remained Celaena's favorite, but the wooden staff became dear. Naturally, it had to do with the fact that she could freely whack him and not chop off an arm. Since her initial meeting with Princess Nehemia, she hadn't seen or heard from the princess, not even chatter from the servants. Hale always came for lunch, and afterward, she joined the other champions for a few more hours of training under Brullo's watchful eye. Most of their training was just to make sure they could actually use weapons. And, of course, she kept her head down throughout it all, doing enough to keep Brullo from critiquing her, but not enough to make him praise her the way he did Cain. Cain. How she loathed him. Brullo practically worshipped the man and even The other champions nodded their respect when he passed by. No one bothered to comment on how perfect her form was. Was this how the other assassins of Assassin's Keep had felt all those years she had spent hogging Arab and Hamel's attention? But here, it was hard to focus when Kane was nearby, taunting and sneering, waiting for her to make one mistake. Hopefully he wouldn't distract her at the first elimination test. Brullo hadn't given them any indication what they might be tested for, and Kale was just as clueless. The day before the first test, she knew something was wrong long before she got to the training hall. Kale hadn't shown up for breakfast, but rather sent her guards to bring her to the training hall to practice on her own. He didn't show up for lunch either, and by the time she was escorted to the hall, she was brimming with questions. Without Kale to stand near, she lingered beside a pillar, watching the competitors file in, flanked by guards and their trainers. Brullo wasn't there yet. Another oddity. And there were far too many guards in the training hall today. What do you suppose this is about? Knox Owen, the young thief from Paranth, asked from beside her. After proving himself somewhat skilled during practice, many of the other competitors had sought him out, but he still opted to keep to himself. Captain Westfall didn't train me this morning, she offered. What was the harm in admitting that? Knox held out his hand. Knox Owen. I know who you are, she said, but shook his hand anyway. His grip was solid, his hand calloused and scarred. He'd seen his fair share of action. Good. I've felt a bit invisible with that hulking lout showing off these past few days. He jerked his chin toward Kane, who was in the middle of examining his bulging biceps. A large ring of black, iridescent stone glimmered on Kane's finger. Strange that he'd wear it to practice. Knox went on. Did you see Varen? He looks like he's going to be sick. He pointed to the loudmouthed thief that Celaena wanted to knock out cold. Normally, Varen could be found near Kane, taunting the other champions. But today he stood alone by the window, face pale and eyes wide. I heard him talking to Kane, said a timid voice behind them, and they found Pelaer, the youngest assassin, standing nearby. She'd spent half a day watching Pelaer, and while she only pretended to be mediocre, he truly could use the training. Assassin indeed. His voice hasn't even deepened yet. How did he wind up here? What did he say? Knox put his hands in his pockets. His clothes weren't as ratty as the other competitors. The mere fact that she'd actually heard his name implied he must have been a good thief in Paranth. Pelaer's freckled face paled a bit. Bill Chastain the Eye-Eater was found stone cold dead this morning. A champion was dead? And a notorious killer at that. How? She demanded. Pelaer swallowed hard. Varen said it wasn't pretty. Like someone ripped him wide open. He passed the body on his way here. Knox cursed under his breath, and Celaena studied the other champions. A hush had fallen on the group, and clusters of them stood together, whispering. Varen's story was spreading fast. Pelaer went on. He said Chastain's body was in ribbons. A chill snaked down her spine, but she shook her head just as a guard entered and told them that Brullo had ordered them to have free rein of the training hall today, and to practice what they wanted. Needing to distract herself from image forming in her mind, she didn't bother to say goodbye to Knox and Pelaer. As she strode to the weapons rack and gathered a belt strapped with throwing knives, she took up a place near the archery targets. Knox joined her a moment later and started firing his knives at the target. He hit the second ring, but never got any closer to the center. His skill with knives wasn't nearly as good as his archery. She drew a dagger from the belt. Who would have killed one of the champions so brutally? And how had they gotten away with it? if the body weighs in the hall. This castle was swarming with guards. A champion was dead, and just a day before their first test. Would this start a pattern? Her focus narrowed to the small, black dot in the center of the target. She steadied her breathing as she cocked her arm, letting her wrist go loose. The sounds of the other champions faded. The blackness of the bullseye beckoned, and as she exhaled, she sent the dagger flying. It sparkled, a shooting star of steel. She smiled grimly as it struck home. Beside her, Nox swore colorfully when his dagger hit the third ring on his target, and her smile broadened, despite the shredded corpse that lay somewhere in the castle. Celaena drew another dagger, but paused as Varen called to her from the ring, where he sparred with Cain. Circus tricks ain't much use when you're the king's champion. She shifted her gaze to him, but kept position toward the target. You'd be better off on your back, learning tricks useful to a woman. In fact, I can teach you some tonight, if you'd like. He laughed, and Cain joined with him. Celaena gripped the hilt of a dagger so hard that it hurt. Don't listen to them, Nox murmured. He tossed another dagger, missing the bullseye again. They wouldn't know the first thing to do with a woman, even if one walked stark naked into their bedroom. Celaena threw her dagger, and the blade clanged as it landed a hair's breadth from the one she'd already embedded in the bullseye. Nox's dark brows rose, accentuating his gray eyes. He couldn't have been older than 25. You've got impressive aim. For a girl, she challenged. No, he said, and threw another dagger. For anyone. The dagger yet again missed the mark. He stalked to the target, yanking out all 6 daggers and shoving them in their sheaths before returning to the throwing line. Celaena cleared her throat. You're standing wrong, she said, quietly enough so the other champions couldn't hear. And you're holding your wrist incorrectly. Nox lowered his arm. She took up her stance. Legs like this, she said. He studied her for a moment, then positioned his legs similarly. Bend slightly at the knees. Shoulders back, loosen your wrist. Throw when you exhale. She demonstrated for him, and her dagger found its mark. Show me again, Nox said appreciatively. She did so, and struck the target. Then she threw with her left hand, and fought her whoop of triumph as the blade sank into the handle of another dagger. Nox focused on the target as he brought up his arm. Well, you've just put me to shame, he said, laughing under his breath as he lifted his dagger higher. Keep your wrist even looser, was her reply. It's all about how you snap it. Nox obeyed, and as he exhaled a long breath, his dagger flew. It didn't hit the bullseye, but it came within the inner circle. His brows rose. That's a bit of an improvement. Just a bit, she said, and held her ground as he gathered their knives from the 2 targets and handed hers back. She sheathed them in her belt. You're from Paranth, right? She asked. Though she'd never been to Paranth, Terrasen's second largest city, the mention of her homeland still spiked a bolt of fear and guilt. It had been 10 years since the royal family had been butchered, 10 years since the king of Adarlan had marched his army in, 10 years since Terrasen met its doom with bowed heads and silence. She shouldn't have mentioned it. She didn't know why she mentioned it, actually. She schooled her features into polite interest as Nox nodded. This is my first time out of Paranth, actually. You said you were from Belhaven, didn't you? My father is a merchant, she lied. And what does he think about a daughter who steals jewels for a living? She conceded a smile and hurled a knife into the target. He won't be inviting me home for a while, that's for certain. Ah, you're in good hands, though. You've got the best trainer out of anyone. I've seen you two running at dawn. I have to beg mine to put down the bottle and let me train outside of lessons." He inclined his head toward his trainer, who sat against the wall, the hood of his cape over his eyes. "Sleeping, yet again." "The captain of the guard is a pain in my ass at times," she said, chuckling. "Another knife, but you're right, he's the best." Knox was quiet for a moment before he said, "The next time we pair off for lessons, find me, will you?" "Why?" She reached for another dagger, but found she'd depleted her stock. Again. Knox threw another dagger, and it hit the bullseye this time. "Because my gold's on you winning this whole damn thing." She smiled a little. "Let's hope you won't be eliminated at the test tomorrow." She scanned the training hall for any sign of the challenge to come the following morning, but found nothing out of the ordinary. The other competitors remained mostly quiet, save for Kane and Varen, and many of them were pale as snow. "And let's hope neither of us winds up like the Eye-Eater," she added, and meant it. "Don't you ever do anything other than read," said Cale. She started from her chair on the balcony as he took a seat beside her. The late afternoon sunlight warmed her face, and the last balmy breeze of autumn rushed through heron-bound hair. She stuck out her tongue. "Shouldn't you be looking into the Eye-Eaters murder?" He never came to her rooms after lunch. Something dark flitted across his eyes. "That's none of your business. And don't try to pry details from me about it," he added as she opened her mouth. He pointed to the book in her lap. "I saw at lunch that you're reading The Wind and the Rain, and I forgot to ask what you thought." He'd really come to talk about a book when a champion's corpse had been found that morning? "It's a bit dense," she admitted, holding up the brown volume in her lap. When he didn't reply, she asked, "Why are you really here?" "I had a long day." She massaged an ache in her knee. "Because of Bill's murder?" "Because the prince dragged me into a council meeting that lasted for 3 hours, he said, a muscle in his jaw feathering. "I thought His Royal Highness was your friend." "He is." "How long have you been friends?" He paused, and she knew he was contemplating how she might use the information against him, weighing the risk of telling her the truth. She was about to snap at him when he said, "Since we were young. We were the only boys for age in the castle, at least of high rank. We had lessons together, played together, trained together. But when I was 13, my father moved my family back to our home in Aniel." The city on the Silver Lake? It somehow made sense that Cale's family ruled Aniel. The citizens of Aniel were warriors from birth, and had been guardians against the hordes of the wild men from the White Fanned Mountains for generations. Thankfully, things had gotten a little easier for the warriors of Aniel in the past 10 years. The White Fanned Mountain men had been one of the first peoples to be put down by Adarlan's conquering armies, and very rarely did their rebels make it to slavery. She'd heard tales of mountain men killing their wives and children, then themselves, rather than be taken by Adarlan. The thought of Cale going up against hundreds of them against men built like Cain made her a little sick. "Yes," Cale said, fiddling with the long hunting knife at his side. "I was slotted to join the Royal Council. Like my father, he wanted me to spend some time among my own people, and learn whatever it is councilmen learn. He said that with the king's army now in the mountains, we could move our interests from fighting the mountain folk to politics." His golden eyes were distant. "But I missed Rifthold." "So you ran away?" She marveled that he was volunteering this much hadn't. He refused to tell her almost anything about himself while traveling from Endevier? Ran away? Cale chuckled. "No. Dorian convinced the captain of the guard to take me as his apprentice, with the help of Brullo. My father refused. So I abdicated my title as Lord of Aniel to my brother and left the next day." The captain's silence suggested what he could not say. That his father hadn't objected. What of his mother? He loosed a long breath. What about you, then? She crossed her arms. I thought you didn't want to know anything about me. There was a ghost of a smile on his face as he watched the sky melt into a smear of tangerine. What do your parents make of their daughter being a Darlan's assassin? My parents are dead, she said. They died when I was 8. So you. Her heart thundered in her chest. I was born in Terrasen, then I became an assassin, then I went to Endivere, and now I'm here. And that's it. Silence fell, then he asked, where'd you get that scar on your right hand? She didn't need to glance at the jagged line that ran along the top of her hand, just above her wrist. She flexed her fingers. When I was 12, Arabin Hamel decided I wasn't nearly as skilled at swordplay with my left hand. So he gave me a choice, either he could break my right hand, or I could do it myself. The phantom memory of the blinding pain lanced through her hand. That night, I put my hand against a doorframe, and slammed the door shut on it. I split my hand wide open and broke 2 bones. It took months to heal, months during which I could only use my left hand. She gave him a vicious smile. I bet Brullo never did that to you. No, he said quietly. No, he didn't. He cleared his throat and stood. The first test is tomorrow. Are you ready? Of course, she lied. He remained standing there for a moment longer, studying her. I'll see you tomorrow morning, he said, and left. In the silence that followed in his wake, she contemplated his story, the paths that had made them so different, but saw similar. She wrapped her arms around herself, a cold wind picking up the skirts off her dress and blowing them behind her. Chapter 15. Though she'd never admit it, Celaena didn't really know what to expect at their first test. With all the training over the past 5 days and fiddling with various weapons and techniques, her body ached. Which was another thing she'd never admit, even though hiding the throbbing pain in her limbs was nearly impossible. As Celaena and Kale entered the giant sparring room in the morning, she glanced at her competitors and remembered she wasn't the only one who hadn't a clue what to expect. A towering black curtain had been swept across half of the room, blocking the other half from sight. Whatever lay beyond that curtain, she realized, was to decide the fate of one of them. The normal ruckus had been replaced by a rustling quiet, and rather than mill about, the competitors lingered by their trainers' sides. She kept close to Kale, which wasn't a change from the ordinary. But the sponsors atop the mezzanine looking over the black and white checkered floor were. Her throat tightened as her gaze met with that of the Crown Prince. Aside from sending her his books, she hadn't seen or heard from him since the meeting with the king. He flashed her a grin, those sapphire eyes gleaming in the morning light. She offered him a tight smile in return and quickly looked away. Brullo stood by the curtain, a scarred hand upon his sword, and Celaena studied the scene. Someone stepped to her side. She knew who it was before he spoke. It's a bit dramatic, don't you think? She glanced sidelong at Nox. Kale tensed next to her, and she could feel him watching the thief closely, no doubt wondering if she and Nox were formulating some escape plan that would include the deaths of every member of the royal family. After 5 days of mindless training, she replied quietly, all too aware that very few people were speaking in the hall. I'm glad for a bit of excitement. Nox laughed under his breath. What do you think it is? She shrugged, heaping her attention on the curtain. More and more competitors were arriving, and soon the clock would strike 9, the time when the test would begin. Even if she knew what was behind the curtain, she certainly wouldn't help him. Hopefully it's a pack of man-eating wolves that we'll have to take on with our bare hands. She looked at him fully now, a half-smile in her lips. Wouldn't that be fun? Kale suddenly cleared his throat. Now was not the time for talking. She stuffed her hands into the pockets of her black pants. Best of luck, she said to Knox. Before she strode toward the curtain, Cale following her. When they were far enough away, she asked under her breath, "No idea what's behind that curtain?" Cale shook his head. She adjusted the thick leather belt slung low across her hips. It was the kind of belt intended to bear the weight of multiple weapons. Its lightness now only reminded her of what she'd lost and what she had to gain. The death of the Eye-Eater yesterday had been fortunate in one aspect, one less man to compete with. She glanced up at Dorian. He could probably see what was behind the curtain from his place on the mezzanine. Why not help her cheat a little? She flicked her attention to the other sponsor's nobleman in fine clothing and ground her teeth at the sight of Parrington. He smirked as he watched Kane, who was stretching out his muscular arms. Had he already told Kane what was beyond the curtain? Brollo cleared his throat. "Attention now," he called to them. All of the competitors tried to look calm as he strode to the center of the curtain. "Your first test has arrived." He grinned broadly, as if whatever the curtain concealed was going to torment the hell out of them. "As His Majesty has ordered, one of you will be eliminated today, one of you will be deemed unworthy. Just get on with it." She thought, her jaw clenched tight. As if he'd read her thoughts, Brollo snapped his fingers, and a guard standing by the wall pulled the curtain back. Inch by inch, it swayed away, until Celaena bit down her laugh. "Archery? It was an archery contest?" "Rules are simple," Brollo said. Behind him, 5 targets were staggered at various distances through the hall. You get 5 shots, 1 per target. The one with the worst aim goes home. Some competitors began murmuring, but it was all she could do to keep from beaming. Unfortunately, Kane didn't bother to hide his triumphant grin. Why couldn't he have been the champion who was found dead? "You'll go one at a time," Brollo said, and behind them a pair of soldiers rolled out a cart of bows and quivers loaded with arrows. "Form a line at the table to determine your order. The test begins now." She expected them to rush to the long table stacked with identical bows and arrows, but apparently none of the 21 other competitors were in much of a hurry to go home. Celaena made to join the forming line, but Cale grasped her shoulder. "Don't show off," he warned. She smiled sweetly and pried his fingers off her. "I'll try not to," she purred, and joined the line. It was an enormous leap of faith to give them arrows, even if the tips were blunted. A dull head wouldn't stop it from going through Parrington's throat or Dorian's, if she wanted. Though the thought was entertaining, she kept her attention on the competitors. With 22 champions and 5 shots each, the test took a dreadfully long time. Thanks to Cale pulling her aside, she'd been in the back off the line, not dead last, but 3 from the end. Far enough back that she had to watch everyone else go before her, including Kane. The other competitors did well enough. The giant circular targets were composed of 5 colored rings, yellow marking the center, with only a tiny black to mark the bullseye. Each target got smaller the farther back it was placed, and because the room was so long, the final target was nearly 70 yards away. Celaena ran her fingers along the smooth curve of her yew-bow. Archery was one of the first skills Arabin had taught her, a staple of any assassin's training. 2 of the assassins further proved it with easy, skilled shots. Though they didn't hit the bullseyes, and their shots got sloppier the farther the target, whoever their masters had been, they'd known what they were teaching. Pelaire, the gangly assassin, wasn't yet strong enough to manage a longbow, and barely made any shots. When he finished, his eyes gleaming with resentment, the champions sniggered, and Kane laughed the loudest. Brollo's face was grim. Didn't anyone ever teach you how to use a bow? Boy. Pelaer lifted his head, glaring at the weapons master with surprising brazenness. I'm more skilled in poisons. Poisons. Brullo threw his hands up. The king wants a champion and you couldn't shoot a cow in a pasture. The weapons master waved Pelaer off. The other champions laughed again, and Celaena wanted nothing more than to smile with them. But Pelaer took a shuddering breath, his shoulders relaxing, and joined the other finished competitors. If he wound up being eliminated, where would they bring him? To prison or some other hellhole? Despite herself, Celaena felt badly for the boy. His shots hadn't been that bad. It was Nox, actually, who surprised her most, with 3 bullseyes into the nearer targets and the 2 final shots along the border of the inner ring. Perhaps she should consider him for an ally. From the way the other competitors watched him as he strode to the back of the room, she knew they were thinking the same thing. Grave, the repulsive assassin, did fine, she supposed. 4 bullseyes, and the final shot right on the border of the innermost ring. But then Kane stepped up too. The white line painted at the back of the room, drew back his U-bow, his black ring glinting, and fired. Again, and again, and again, within the span of a few seconds. And when the sound of his final shot stopped echoing in the suddenly silent chamber, Celaena's stomach turned over. 5 bullseyes. Her one consolation was that none of them had been on that black, the absolute center. One had come close, though. For some reason, the line started moving quickly. All she could think about was Kane getting applauded by Parrington, Kane getting clapped on the back by Brullo, Kane getting all of that praise and attention, not because he was a mountain of muscle, but because he actually deserved it. Suddenly, Celaena found herself standing at the white line, looking at the vast length of the room before her. Some of the men chuckled, albeit quietly, and she kept her head held high as she reached over her shoulder for an arrow and knocked it into her bow. They'd done some archery practice a few days earlier, and she'd been excellent. Or, as excellent as she could be without attracting attention. And she killed men from longer shots than the farthest target. Clean shots, too. Right through the throat. She tried to swallow, but her mouth was dry. I am Celaena Sardothien, a Darlan's assassin. If these men knew who I was, they'd stop laughing. I am Celaena Sardothien. I am going to win. I will not be afraid. She pulled back her bow, the sore muscles in her arm aching with the effort. She shut out noise, shut out movement, shut out anything other than the sound of her breathing as her focus narrowed on the first target. She took a steady breath. As she exhaled, she let the arrow fly. Bullseye. The tightness in her stomach abated, and she sighed through her nose. It wasn't an absolute bullseye, but she hadn't been aiming for it, anyway. Some men stopped laughing, but she paid them no heed as she knocked another arrow and fired at the second target. She aimed for the edge of the innermost ring, which she hit with deadly precision. She could have made an entire circle of arrows, if she'd wanted. And if she'd had enough ammunition. She got another bullseye on the third target, aiming for the edge, but landing within the border. She did the same for the fourth target, but aimed for the opposite side of the bullseye. Where she aimed, the arrow met its mark. As she reached for her last arrow, she heard one of the competitors, a red-haired mercenary named Renaud, snigger. She clenched her bow tightly enough for the wood to groan, and pulled back her final shot. The target was little more than a blur of color, so far back that its bullseye was a grain of sand in the vastness of the room. She couldn't see the little dot in its center that no one had yet to touch, even Kane. Celaena's arm trembled with effort as she pulled the string back a bit farther and fired. The arrow hit the absolute center, obliterating the black dot. They stopped, laughing. No one said anything to her when she stalked away from the line and tossed her bow back onto the cart. Hale only scowled at her obviously, she hadn't been that inconspicuous, but Dorian smiled. She sighed and joined the competitors waiting for the competition to finish, keeping well away from all of them. When their marks were compared by Brollo himself, one of the army soldiers, not young Pelayer, wound up being eliminated. But though she hadn't lost by any means, Celaena could not stand the feeling that she hadn't really won anything at all.